Do people who like deathcore generally also like death metal? I just got into deathcore last week completely unexpectedly. I'd listened to a fair bit of death metal a while ago out of curiosity, and it really did not resonate with me at all. But now going back and listening to it again, I think it sounds incredibly similar to deathcore, and despite that, I still don't like it. They're obviously different with similar elements, but I can't figure out what exactly makes me dislike one and really enjoy the other. I don't know if I just have some internal bias against it, or if most deathcore fans don't like death metal either. I think most people are saying the same thing in response to this, but I think I've thought about this a lot since listening to metal, especially in recent years, I guess. Obviously, this person is saying he got into deathcore last week, so this is all circumstantial to which bands he's listened to and which bands he hasn't listened to. And obviously there are better examples within deathcore and death metal of bands doing things well or different or unique versus bands that are doing things bland. There's a ton of that in deathcore, and there's a ton of that in death metal on both ends of the spectrum. Okay, this is what I wrote. Personally, I think I enjoy deathcore mainly because of the contrast, and this is something I talk about a lot. All right, so blast beats versus breakdowns, high screams versus the gutturals, and everything in between, the different types of riffs within a song. So obviously, I think in deathcore, there is a very eclectic mix of different styles of riffs going on that make up a deathcore song. A lot of death metal lacks contrast, not all, but especially more traditional or old school death metal. So I'm thinking a lot of old school death metal having that Chris Barnes vocal, and that's basically what you get from start to finish the song. There isn't much contrast. It's very linear. It's kind of samey from start to finish. Obviously, like I said earlier, some bands do it better than others. Some bands do it worse than others. So there's plenty of examples of both. The few bands that do it better are what make each genre its best. Like, we're not going to compare shitty deathcore bands versus shitty death metal bands. That's not the point. We can try and compare the best. And if I'm being honest, even within death metal, which I generally think to be more bland, if we look at certain bands like Archspire, for example, I mean, they've got a ton of contrast. They've got a ton of different riffing going on. They've got a ton of tempo changes. The screams are super unique and fast and slow and everything in between. So going through the comments on this thread, most people were saying, hey, I don't really like death metal either, but tech death is cool, or mellow death is cool, or slam is cool, or brutal death metal is cool. And I think most people that are saying these things are referring to the fact that those specific subgenres of death metal, they have more contrast. They're more interesting to listen to. There's a bit more to it than traditional death metal. I think there are just oftentimes more similarities between deathcore and those subgenres for the reasons I just talked about. And then this is kind of repeating what I just said, but obviously there are exceptions to everything, and some bands that do certain genres so well that they transcend those typical barriers. But that's kind of how I think about death metal versus deathcore. I generally become uninterested halfway through a typical death metal song that's all blast beats and one vocal tone. Again, I think that's the main reason why deathcore blew up. There's just a mix of different elements that made it so that people that maybe enjoyed hardcore and people that enjoyed death metal, all of a sudden, both of these people could kind of enjoy this new genre. And maybe people that liked the idea of death metal, all of a sudden, were finding out about bands that had death metal elements, so those cool ideas, but executed in a way that was more listenable, that was more interesting to listen to. And I'm not saying that like breakdown saved death metal. It's not like one or the other, but I definitely think that deathcore specifically brought a lot of different elements together that just made metal more interesting. And that's kind of like my take on deathcore versus death metal, and why I think a lot of people will gravitate towards deathcore and not necessarily enjoy death metal as well.